Picture this scenario. You're married to a woman who, for 15 years, has been the steady foundation of your family. She's organized the household, managed the schedules, supported your career ambitions, and created a warm home environment that everyone admires. Then something shifts. Almost overnight, she starts questioning everything about her life choices. She's restless, distant, and suddenly interested in activities she never cared about before. She's talking about finding herself, exploring new possibilities, and making dramatic changes that seem to come from nowhere. You're standing there, wondering what happened to the woman you married. Where did this sudden transformation come from? Why is she acting like a completely different person? And most importantly, what does this mean for your relationship and your family? What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you understand female psychology during midlife transitions. The uncomfortable truth that most relationship experts won't discuss is this: women experience profound psychological and biological changes around age 40 that create entirely new relationship dynamics. These aren't random personality shifts or temporary phases. They're predictable patterns rooted in brain chemistry, hormonal fluctuations, and evolutionary programming that most people never see coming. This isn't about blaming or attacking women. This is about understanding the biological and psychological realities that drive behavior during this critical life stage. When you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, you can navigate these changes with wisdom instead of confusion. You can protect your relationship instead of watching it deteriorate. You can respond strategically instead of reacting emotionally to behaviors that seem completely irrational. But here's what makes this information so valuable. I've spent years studying the intersection of evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and relationship dynamics. I've analyzed thousands of case studies, interviewed relationship counselors, and examined the research that reveals how female brain chemistry changes during midlife transitions. What I've discovered is a pattern so consistent and predictable that once you understand it, you'll never look at relationship changes the same way again. The reality is that most men are completely unprepared for what happens when their partner hits this life stage. They interpret behavioral changes as personal attacks or relationship failures when they're actually witnessing biological programming that's been hardwired over millions of years of evolution. This lack of understanding destroys relationships that could have been saved with the right knowledge and approach. So what exactly happens to women during this transition period? The changes begin in the brain itself. Around age 40, female brains undergo significant alterations in neurotransmitter production and hormonal regulation. The chemicals that once provided satisfaction from routine activities and familiar relationships begin operating at reduced levels. What used to bring joy and fulfillment now feels mundane and unfulfilling. Think of it like this. For 20 years, her brain operated on a specific chemical cocktail that made domestic life, stable relationships, and predictable routines feel rewarding. The same activities that once released pleasure hormones now barely register. Her neurological reward system requires increasingly intense stimulation to achieve the same level of satisfaction she once got from simple pleasures. This isn't a conscious choice. This is brain chemistry demanding novelty, excitement, and new experiences to generate the neurological rewards that routine life no longer provides. The woman who was once perfectly content with weekend family activities now finds them boring and restrictive. The relationship that once felt comfortable and secure now feels stagnant and limiting. But the changes go deeper than just brain chemistry. There's an evolutionary component that most people never consider. Throughout human history, women who could successfully transition from their reproductive years to their post-reproductive years needed different survival strategies. The behaviors that worked for attracting mates and raising children become less relevant. New behaviors focused on personal resources, social status, and individual survival become more important. Modern women still carry this evolutionary programming. When they reach their 40s, ancient survival instincts begin activating that prioritize personal fulfillment over family obligations. This isn't selfishness. This is biology preparing them for a different life stage with different survival requirements. The problem is that modern society hasn't adapted to accommodate these biological realities. The first sign most men notice is the questioning phase. She starts examining every aspect of her life with critical scrutiny. The career choices she made to support the family suddenly feel like sacrifices she can no longer tolerate. The social activities that revolved around couple, friends, and family gatherings now seem boring and unfulfilling. The hobbies she abandoned for domestic responsibilities suddenly become urgent priorities. This questioning isn't random. It follows a specific pattern that reveals the underlying psychological process. She's essentially conducting a cost-benefit analysis of her entire life, measuring what she's given up against what she's received in return. Every compromise she made during her 20s and 30s gets re-examined through a new lens that prioritizes her individual needs over collective family needs. During this phase, conversations become loaded with subtext. When she mentions friends who are traveling, pursuing new careers, or making dramatic life changes, she's not making casual observations. She's conducting research on alternative life paths. When she talks about feeling stuck or unfulfilled, she's not just expressing temporary dissatisfaction. She's articulating a fundamental shift in her psychological priorities. The second phase involves active experimentation. This is when you'll notice her trying new activities, connecting with different social groups, and exploring interests that seem to come from nowhere. She might start taking classes, joining fitness groups, or pursuing hobbies that require time and energy she previously devoted to family activities. These aren't innocent diversions. They're testing grounds for alternative identities and lifestyles. What makes this phase particularly challenging for relationships is that her experimentation often involves comparing her current life to hypothetical alternatives. She's not just trying new activities, she's evaluating whether these activities could form the foundation of a completely different life. Every new experience becomes evidence that she's been missing out on personal fulfillment by prioritizing family obligations. The social component of this experimentation is especially significant. She'll gravitate toward friends who support her exploration and validate her desire for change. These are often women who have already made dramatic life transitions or who are going through similar questioning phases. These friendships become echo chambers that amplify dissatisfaction with current circumstances while romanticizing alternative lifestyles. During this experimentation phase, her relationship with you becomes a measuring stick against other possibilities. She's not consciously comparing you to other men, but she is comparing the life you represent to other potential life paths. The stability and predictability that once felt like security now feel like limitations. The shared history that once felt like a foundation now feels like baggage preventing her from exploring new possibilities. The third phase is the most dangerous for relationships because this is when fantasy becomes action. She's moved beyond questioning and experimenting to actually planning significant changes. This might involve career transitions, social circle changes, or even geographic relocation. What started as idle curiosity about alternative lifestyles has evolved into concrete steps toward implementing those alternatives. This is the phase where many men realize something serious is happening. But by this point, the psychological momentum has built to a level that's extremely difficult to redirect. She's not just thinking about change anymore. She's emotionally invested in change as the solution to her dissatisfaction. The relationship becomes an obstacle to overcome rather than a partnership to preserve. The challenge for men during this phase is that traditional relationship repair strategies often backfire. Attempting to address her concerns through increased attention, romantic gestures, or lifestyle adjustments can actually accelerate the process by confirming that the relationship requires fundamental changes to remain viable. Your efforts to save the relationship become evidence that the relationship was problematic in the first place. Understanding these phases reveals why so many men feel blindsided by relationship changes that seem to emerge suddenly. The process actually unfolds over months or years, but the early signs are subtle and easy to misinterpret. By the time the changes become obvious, the psychological transformation is already well advanced. The biological drivers behind these phases explain why logical arguments and emotional appeals often prove ineffective. You're not dealing with conscious relationship dissatisfaction that can be resolved through communication and compromise. You're dealing with neurological and hormonal changes that create genuine alterations in how she experiences life and relationships. This is why understanding the science behind these changes is so crucial. When you recognize that her behavior is driven by biological programming rather than personal failings or relationship problems, you can respond strategically instead of defensively. You can work with these natural processes instead of fighting against them. You can protect your relationship by understanding the forces that threaten it. But here's where most advice gets it completely wrong. The typical response to relationship changes during this period involves trying to return things to how they used to be. Men attempt to recreate the dynamics that worked during earlier stages of the relationship. This approach fails because it ignores the fundamental reality that she has changed at a biological and psychological level. The woman you're trying to reconnect with literally doesn't exist anymore. The key insight that changes everything is this: you cannot solve a biological problem with relationship tactics. When her brain chemistry has fundamentally altered how she processes rewards and satisfaction, buying flowers or planning romantic dinners doesn't address the underlying issue. It's like trying to fix a car's engine problems by washing the exterior. You're working on the wrong system entirely. This is why so many well-intentioned husbands find themselves frustrated and confused during this period. They're applying solutions that worked perfectly well for 20 years, but now those same approaches seem to make things worse. She interprets their increased attention as pressure. She views their romantic efforts as attempts to manipulate her back into old patterns. She sees their concern as evidence that they don't understand what she's going through. What's actually happening is that her neurological reward system now requires novelty and unpredictability to function properly. The gestures that once made her feel loved and appreciated now feel routine and expected. Her brain literally processes familiar positive experiences differently than it did before. This isn't ingratitude or relationship problems. This is neuroscience in action. Consider how this plays out in practical terms. For years, she appreciated when you remembered anniversaries, brought home her favorite wine, or planned weekend getaways to places you'd visited before. These gestures triggered positive neurological responses that reinforced her satisfaction with the relationship. But now, those same exact gestures barely register on her emotional radar. Her brain has adapted to these rewards, and they no longer produce the chemical responses they once did. Meanwhile, unexpected interactions with new people, unfamiliar experiences, and novel challenges flood her system with the neurochemicals she's been missing. A conversation with a stranger at the coffee shop generates more excitement than a romantic dinner with you. A spontaneous invitation to try something new creates more anticipation than your carefully planned anniversary celebration. This isn't personal. This is biology seeking the stimulation it requires to function optimally. The tragedy is that most men interpret this biological reality as evidence that they're failing as husbands. They assume that if she's not responding to their efforts, they must not be trying hard enough or doing the right things. So they escalate their attempts to recreate the emotional connection that worked in the past. They plan bigger surprises, express their feelings more openly, and invest more time and energy into romantic gestures. But this approach actually accelerates the problem because it confirms her growing belief that the relationship is stuck in outdated patterns. Your increased efforts to maintain familiar dynamics become evidence that you don't understand her need for something different. The harder you try to preserve what you had, the more clearly she sees the gap between what you're offering and what her brain is demanding. This creates a vicious cycle that destroys relationships, even when both people genuinely love each other. She's not trying to hurt you when she seems unresponsive to your efforts. She's literally incapable of generating the same emotional responses she had before. Her neurological hardware has been upgraded, but you're still running the old software. The incompatibility isn't personal, it's biological. Understanding this dynamic reveals why traditional marriage counseling often fails during this period. Therapists trained in communication techniques and conflict resolution are addressing relationship problems, but you're not dealing with a relationship problem. You're dealing with a neurological transition that creates relationship symptoms. It's like treating a broken arm with relationship advice. You're working on the wrong system entirely. The women going through this transition often can't explain what's happening because they don't understand it themselves. They know something feels different, but they can't articulate the biological and psychological changes occurring beneath conscious awareness. They might say they feel stuck or unfulfilled or restless, but these are descriptions of symptoms, not explanations of causes. This confusion leads to what I call the narrative creation process. When people can't understand why they feel the way they do, they create stories that make sense of their experiences. These narratives become powerful drivers of behavior because they provide logical frameworks for emotional realities that would otherwise seem irrational. In this case, the narrative usually focuses on relationship limitations and missed opportunities. Since she can't explain why familiar activities and relationships no longer provide satisfaction, she concludes that these activities and relationships must be inadequate. Since she can't understand why she craves novelty and excitement, she decides that her current life lacks adventure and spontaneity. These narratives aren't consciously deceptive. They're genuine attempts to make sense of neurological changes that are largely invisible to conscious awareness. But they become self-fulfilling prophecies that shape behavior and decision-making. Once she's convinced that her dissatisfaction stems from relationship limitations, every interaction gets filtered through this interpretive framework. Your attempts to address her concerns get reframed as evidence that the relationship requires constant management to remain viable. Your expressions of love get interpreted as attempts to maintain a status quo that no longer serves her needs. Your resistance to dramatic changes gets viewed as selfishness or fear of her personal growth. This interpretive framework explains why conversations during this period often feel like you're speaking different languages. You're discussing relationship dynamics and trying to solve practical problems. She's processing everything through a narrative that frames the relationship itself as the primary obstacle to her fulfillment. You're offering solutions to problems she's no longer trying to solve. The most dangerous aspect of this process is that it becomes increasingly resistant to contrary evidence. Every positive interaction that might challenge her narrative gets dismissed as temporary or insufficient. Every negative interaction gets amplified as confirmation that fundamental changes are necessary. The psychological momentum builds toward transformation, regardless of relationship quality or compatibility. This is why the timing of these changes often seems so arbitrary to outside observers. The relationship might be functioning perfectly well by traditional measures when she suddenly announces that she needs space, wants to explore new possibilities, or feels like she's lost herself in the marriage. These declarations aren't responses to relationship failures. They're expressions of biological drives that have reached a tipping point. The social environment compounds these biological and psychological pressures through cultural messaging that validates and encourages dramatic midlife transitions. Modern society celebrates women who leave stable situations to pursue personal fulfillment. Media narratives romanticize stories of women who abandon conventional lives to discover their authentic selves. Social media algorithms feed content that reinforces dissatisfaction with ordinary domesticity. This cultural programming creates external validation for internal biological drives. Her neurological craving for novelty gets reinforced by social messages telling her she deserves excitement. Her psychological need for individual identity gets amplified by cultural narratives about female empowerment. Her evolutionary programming toward personal resource acquisition gets justified through stories about women who prioritize themselves over family obligations. The combination of biological drives, psychological narratives, and cultural validation creates a perfect storm that can overwhelm even strong relationships. She's not choosing to destroy her family. She's responding to multiple converging forces that make dramatic change feel both necessary and justified. Understanding these forces is the first step toward developing strategies that work with them rather than against them. But here's what most men miss entirely. These changes, while challenging, also represent opportunities. The same neurological alterations that create relationship problems also open possibilities for deeper connection and renewed attraction. The key is understanding how to work with her transformed psychology instead of trying to fight against it. The mistake most men make is treating these changes like a problem to be solved rather than a transformation to be navigated. When you approach this period with the mindset of returning things to normal, you're essentially telling her that her evolving needs are invalid and that she should suppress her biological drives for the sake of maintaining familiar patterns. This creates resentment and confirms her growing belief that the relationship is holding her back from personal growth. Instead of fighting against these changes, successful men learn to leverage them. They recognize that her increased need for novelty and excitement represents an opportunity to create deeper attraction and connection. But this requires abandoning the approaches that worked during earlier relationship phases and developing strategies that align with her transformed psychology. The first principle is understanding that predictability has become the enemy of attraction. The routine interactions that once provided comfort and security now trigger boredom and restlessness. Your morning coffee together, weekend dinner dates, and familiar conversation patterns have lost their ability to generate positive emotional responses. Her brain has adapted to these experiences, and they no longer produce the neurochemical rewards necessary for relationship satisfaction. This doesn't mean you need to become a completely different person or abandon your authentic personality. It means recognizing that maintaining attraction now requires intentional unpredictability and strategic novelty. The man who can provide emotional variety within a stable framework becomes incredibly valuable to a woman whose brain is craving new experiences. Consider how this principle applies to communication patterns. For 20 years, you might have discussed work stress, family logistics, and weekend plans in predictable ways. These conversations served practical purposes and maintained connection during earlier relationship phases. But now, these same conversation patterns feel routine and unstimulating to her transformed nervous system. The strategic response involves introducing conversational unpredictability while maintaining emotional safety. This might mean sharing perspectives she's never heard from you, discussing topics you've never explored together, or revealing aspects of your personality that you've kept private. The goal isn't to become someone else. It's to reveal dimensions of yourself that provide novelty within familiarity. The second principle involves understanding that her need for individual identity has intensified dramatically. During earlier relationship phases, shared identity and couple activities provided satisfaction and bonding. But her current psychological state requires validation of her individual worth and unique capabilities. She needs to feel like a distinct person, with her own value, rather than half of a partnership. This shift explains why she might resist activities you've always enjoyed together, while pursuing interests that seem completely unrelated to your shared history. She's not rejecting your relationship, she's asserting her individual identity in response to biological programming that now prioritizes personal resource development over collective family goals. The strategic response involves supporting her individual pursuits while maintaining your own distinct identity. This creates what psychologists call differentiation within connection. You remain emotionally available and committed to the relationship while encouraging her exploration of personal interests and goals. This approach validates her need for individual identity without abandoning the relationship framework. But here's where most men make a critical error. They support her individual pursuits while abandoning their own. They become so focused on accommodating her changes that they lose their own sense of purpose and direction. This creates an unattractive dynamic where you're revolving around her transformation instead of maintaining your own compelling life trajectory. The paradox is that the more you sacrifice your own interests to support hers, the less attractive you become to her transformed psychology. Her brain is now wired to respond to strength, independence, and personal mission. When you abandon these qualities to become more accommodating, you're actually reducing your value in her eyes. The third principle recognizes that her relationship with risk and challenge has fundamentally altered. During earlier phases, she likely preferred security and stability over uncertainty and adventure. But her current neurological state craves the stimulation that comes from overcoming challenges and navigating new situations. This explains why she might suddenly express interest in activities that seem completely out of character, learning new skills, traveling to unfamiliar places, or taking on professional challenges that she previously would have avoided. These aren't random whims. They're responses to biological drives that now require challenge and achievement for optimal functioning. The strategic approach involves becoming a source of appropriate challenge rather than comfortable predictability. This doesn't mean creating artificial conflict or drama. It means maintaining standards, boundaries, and expectations that require her to invest effort in the relationship. When everything becomes too easy and accommodating, her brain loses interest because there's no neurological reward for effortless interactions. Think about this in practical terms. The man who agrees with everything she says, accommodates every request, and never challenges her thinking becomes psychologically invisible to her transformed nervous system. But the man who maintains his own perspectives, requires reciprocal effort, and presents interesting challenges becomes neurologically engaging. This principle extends to physical and emotional intimacy as well. Her previous satisfaction with routine affection and predictable sexual patterns has been replaced by a need for intensity and variety. The approaches to intimacy that worked for decades might now feel boring or obligatory to her transformed psychology. The strategic response involves introducing elements of unpredictability and challenge into intimate interactions. This requires reading her responses and calibrating your approach based on her current neurological needs, rather than relying on historical patterns that no longer generate the same results. The fourth principle addresses the social dynamics that influence her transformation. She's likely gravitating toward friends and social groups that validate her desire for change and personal exploration. These relationships provide external reinforcement for her internal biological drives, while potentially undermining her commitment to existing relationship patterns. Understanding this social influence is crucial because it reveals why isolated relationship improvements often prove insufficient. Even if you successfully adapt to her transformed psychology, she's receiving constant external messaging that questions the value of maintaining long-term commitments. Her social environment becomes an echo chamber that amplifies dissatisfaction while romanticizing alternative lifestyles. The strategic response involves understanding the social forces at play without attempting to control them directly. Trying to limit her friendships or criticize her social influences will backfire by confirming her belief that the relationship restricts her personal growth. Instead, focus on becoming the most compelling option in her expanded social landscape. This means developing yourself in ways that create genuine attraction and respect, rather than trying to eliminate competition through restrictions. When you become more interesting, challenging, and valuable than the alternatives she's considering, her social influences become less threatening to the relationship. The fifth principle recognizes that her relationship with time and future planning has shifted dramatically. Previously, she might have been content with long-term stability and gradual progress towards shared goals. But her current psychology creates urgency around personal fulfillment and individual achievement. This temporal shift explains why she might suddenly seem impatient with relationship timelines that previously felt comfortable. Goals that were acceptable as 5-year plans now feel like urgent priorities that require immediate attention. The biological clock isn't just ticking for reproduction anymore. It's ticking for personal actualization and individual legacy creation. The strategic approach involves aligning your relationship trajectory with her intensified sense of urgency while maintaining realistic expectations. This might mean accelerating certain shared goals, supporting her individual ambitions more actively, or creating relationship experiences that feel significant and transformative rather than routine and incremental. But this acceleration must be authentic rather than reactive. If you're only changing your timeline to appease her transformation, she'll sense the accommodation and lose respect for your leadership. The changes need to emerge from your own growth and vision rather than fear of losing her. The sixth principle addresses the reality that her emotional processing has become more intense and variable. The emotional stability that characterized earlier relationship phases has been replaced by heightened sensitivity and more dramatic emotional swings. This isn't instability or mental health problems. It's the neurological reality of a brain that's recalibrating its reward systems and processing mechanisms. This emotional intensity can feel overwhelming if you're not prepared for it. Conversations that would have been minor discussions now become charged interactions with significant emotional stakes. Issues that she previously handled with equanimity now trigger strong reactions that seem disproportionate to the circumstances. The strategic response involves maintaining emotional stability while allowing space for her intensified processing. This means not matching her emotional intensity with your own reactive responses. Instead, you become the grounding force that provides safety for her emotional exploration while maintaining your own centered perspective. This requires developing what psychologists call emotional regulation skills. You need to remain calm and present during her emotional storms without dismissing her feelings or trying to fix them immediately. Your stability becomes attractive to her because it provides the security she needs to process her transformation without fear of abandoning the relationship entirely. The seventh principle acknowledges that her relationship with authority and decision-making has evolved. During earlier phases, she might have been comfortable with traditional decision-making patterns or collaborative approaches that prioritized family harmony over individual preferences. But her transformed psychology now requires more direct input into decisions that affect her life and future. This shift can feel threatening if you interpret it as a challenge to your role or relationship dynamics, but understanding it as a natural evolution of her psychological needs allows you to adapt without losing your own sense of purpose and direction. She's not trying to undermine your authority. She's asserting her individual agency in response to biological drives that now prioritize personal autonomy. The strategic approach involves creating decision-making frameworks that honor her increased need for input while maintaining effective leadership. This might mean consulting her more extensively on decisions that affect her directly, while maintaining your own decision-making authority in areas where you have expertise or responsibility. The key is distinguishing between decisions that require her input and decisions that you can make independently. When you involve her appropriately while maintaining your own decisiveness, you create a dynamic that satisfies her need for agency without abandoning your leadership role. These principles work together to create a comprehensive approach that acknowledges her biological and psychological transformation while maintaining relationship attraction and stability. The men who successfully navigate this period understand that they're not dealing with temporary relationship problems that can be solved through better communication or increased effort. Instead, they're adapting to a fundamental shift in female psychology that requires new strategies, different approaches, and evolved understanding of attraction dynamics. This isn't about becoming someone different. It's about expressing your authentic self in ways that align with her transformed neurological and psychological needs. The transformation period typically lasts between 2 and 5 years, depending on individual circumstances and how effectively both partners navigate the changes. Understanding this timeline helps maintain perspective during challenging phases, while working toward long-term relationship evolution rather than short-term problem solving. But here's the crucial insight that determines success or failure during this period. The changes she's experiencing are not optional. They're biological imperatives driven by evolutionary programming and neurological alterations that cannot be suppressed or ignored. Fighting against these changes destroys relationships. Working with them creates opportunities for deeper connection and renewed attraction. The men who understand this fundamental truth position themselves as partners in her transformation rather than obstacles to it. They recognize that her changes, while disruptive, represent an evolution that can strengthen the relationship if navigated correctly. The alternative is watching the relationship deteriorate as you fight against forces you don't understand and cannot control. This is where most relationship advice completely misses the mark. Traditional counseling approaches focus on communication techniques and conflict resolution strategies that assume both partners are operating from the same psychological baseline. But when one partner has undergone fundamental neurological and hormonal changes, these surface-level interventions prove inadequate. You can't solve a hardware problem with software solutions. Her brain has literally rewired itself, creating new patterns of reward processing, emotional regulation, and priority assessment. Trying to address these biological realities with relationship tactics is like attempting to fix a computer's motherboard by updating the operating system. You're working at the wrong level entirely. This understanding reveals why so many well-meaning husbands find themselves more frustrated after couples therapy than before. They learn new communication skills and conflict resolution techniques, but the underlying biological drives that create the problems remain unaddressed. She might temporarily respond to improved communication, but her transformed psychology continues generating the same core issues. The therapeutic interventions that actually work during this period focus on biological and neurological realities rather than relationship dynamics alone. This might involve understanding how hormonal fluctuations affect mood and decision-making, recognizing how brain chemistry changes influence reward processing, or acknowledging how evolutionary programming shapes behavioral priorities. But most therapists aren't trained in these areas because they're approaching relationship problems from psychological and social perspectives rather than biological ones. They're missing the fundamental drivers that create the symptoms they're trying to treat. It's like treating a fever without addressing the underlying infection. The financial implications of misunderstanding this transformation are staggering. Divorce rates spike dramatically during this age period, precisely because couples interpret biological changes as relationship failures. Men who could have successfully navigated these transitions instead find themselves facing asset division, custody battles, and years of financial devastation. The irony is that many of these divorces occur during what should be the most stable period of marriage. The major stresses of early marriage have been resolved, children are becoming independent, financial security has been established, career pressures are stabilizing. By traditional measures, this should be when relationships become easier and more enjoyable. Instead, this period often becomes the most dangerous time for marriage stability. The biological transformation creates internal pressure that has nothing to do with external relationship quality. A woman can genuinely love her husband, appreciate their life together, and recognize that their relationship is objectively successful while simultaneously feeling compelled to pursue dramatic changes. This disconnect between conscious appreciation and unconscious biological drives explains why these situations feel so confusing and unpredictable. She's not lying when she says she loves you and values the relationship. She's also not lying when she says she needs something different. Both statements can be simultaneously true because they're emerging from different levels of psychological processing. The conscious mind recognizes relationship value and appreciates shared history. The unconscious mind responds to biological programming that prioritizes different goals during this life stage. When these levels conflict, the unconscious drives usually win because they operate below conscious awareness and feel like authentic personal desires. Understanding this conflict allows you to respond to both levels simultaneously. You can acknowledge her conscious appreciation for the relationship while addressing the unconscious drives that create dissatisfaction. This dual approach prevents the all-or-nothing thinking that destroys relationships during this period. Most men make the mistake of appealing only to the conscious level. They remind her of good times, point out relationship strengths, and try to logic their way back to previous dynamics. This approach fails because it doesn't address the biological drives creating the internal pressure for change. Meanwhile, the unconscious programming continues generating dissatisfaction, regardless of how many logical reasons exist to appreciate the relationship. She finds herself in the frustrating position of knowing the relationship is good, while feeling like something essential is missing. This internal conflict often gets projected onto the relationship itself. The strategic approach acknowledges both realities. You validate her conscious appreciation while creating experiences that satisfy her unconscious biological needs. This prevents the internal conflict that makes her question the entire relationship foundation. When both levels of processing are satisfied, the transformation becomes relationship enhancing rather than relationship threatening. But this requires abandoning the victim mentality that many men adopt during this period. It's easy to feel attacked, unappreciated, or unfairly treated when your partner seems to be rejecting everything you've built together. These feelings are understandable, but they prevent you from developing the strategic mindset necessary for successful navigation. The biological transformation isn't about you. It's not a judgment on your worth as a partner or an indication that you failed as a husband. It's an evolutionary process that would occur regardless of relationship quality or partner characteristics. Taking it personally prevents you from responding effectively and often accelerates the very outcomes you're trying to avoid. This perspective shift from personal attack to biological process is crucial for maintaining the emotional stability necessary for strategic response. When you understand that her behavior is driven by forces beyond conscious control, you can remain centered and purposeful instead of reactive and defensive. The men who successfully navigate this period often report that it ultimately strengthened their relationship and created deeper intimacy than they'd previously experienced. The transformation, while challenging, forced both partners to evolve beyond comfortable patterns and discover new dimensions of connection and attraction. But this positive outcome requires understanding the process, developing appropriate strategies, and maintaining perspective during difficult phases. The men who approach this period with knowledge and preparation often find that their relationships emerge stronger and more fulfilling than before. The men who react emotionally or try to fight against the changes typically watch their relationships deteriorate despite their best intentions. The choice between these outcomes often depends on information and approach rather than relationship quality or compatibility. Good marriages can be destroyed by misunderstanding and poor strategy. Mediocre relationships can be transformed into exceptional partnerships through proper navigation of this critical period. The financial, emotional, and family implications of getting this right or wrong are enormous. Understanding female psychology during midlife transitions isn't just relationship advice. It's crisis management that can preserve decades of shared investment and prevent devastating consequences for everyone involved. This is why the information I'm sharing represents such valuable knowledge. Most men stumble through this period blindly, reacting to symptoms without understanding causes, applying outdated strategies to new challenges, and wondering why everything they try seems to make things worse. The men who understand these biological and psychological realities position themselves strategically instead of reactively. They work with natural forces instead of against them. They create opportunities for growth and deeper connection instead of fighting to maintain familiar but outdated patterns. This transformation doesn't have to destroy your relationship. With proper understanding and strategic response, it can become the catalyst for creating something even better than what you had before. The key is recognizing that the woman you married still exists, but she's evolved. Your challenge is evolving alongside her while maintaining your own strength and purpose. The alternative is watching someone you love drift away while you stand helplessly wondering what went wrong. The choice is yours, but the window for strategic response is limited. The longer you wait to understand and adapt to these changes, the more difficult it becomes to influence the outcome. The biological transformation will continue regardless of your response. The question is whether you'll position yourself as an ally in her evolution or an obstacle to overcome. That decision will determine whether this challenging period destroys your relationship or transforms it into something more fulfilling than either of you imagined possible. But understanding is only the first step. Knowing what's happening doesn't automatically provide the tools for effective response. The next crucial element is developing the specific strategies and approaches that work with her transformed psychology instead of against it. This requires abandoning many assumptions about what women want and need in relationships. The conventional wisdom about female psychology during this period is not just wrong, it's actively harmful. Most advice tells men to be more understanding, more accommodating, and more supportive of their partner's need for change. This approach sounds reasonable and caring, but it often accelerates the very problems it's trying to solve. When you become more accommodating in response to her transformation, you're inadvertently confirming her unconscious belief that the relationship has become too comfortable and predictable. Your increased flexibility and understanding, while well-intentioned, can actually reduce attraction by eliminating the challenge and unpredictability her brain now craves. This creates a cruel paradox, where doing what seems right actually makes things worse. The more you try to support her changes by becoming more flexible and accommodating, the less interesting and attractive you become to her transformed psychology. Your efforts to save the relationship through increased understanding actually reduce the very qualities that create attraction. The truth about women's changes after 40 isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. You now understand that these transformations aren't personal attacks on your relationship or failures of your partnership. They're biological imperatives driven by millions of years of evolutionary programming and neurological changes that operate below conscious awareness. The men who recognize these patterns early position themselves strategically instead of reactively. They understand that fighting against these biological forces destroys relationships, while working with them creates opportunities for deeper connection and renewed attraction. This knowledge separates the men who watch their marriages deteriorate from those who emerge with stronger, more fulfilling partnerships. Your response to this information determines everything. You can continue applying outdated relationship strategies that worked 20 years ago, but fail catastrophically during this period. You can keep taking her changes personally and reacting emotionally to behaviors driven by biology. Or you can develop the strategic mindset that successful men use to navigate this critical transition. The window for influence isn't permanent. The longer you wait to understand and adapt to these realities, the more momentum builds toward outcomes you can't control. But when you align your approach with her transformed psychology instead of fighting against it, you become the most compelling option in her expanded world of possibilities. This isn't about manipulation or control. This is about understanding biological truth and responding with wisdom instead of confusion. The relationships that survive and thrive during this period are built on knowledge, strategy, and acceptance of evolutionary realities, rather than wishful thinking and outdated assumptions. The choice is yours. You can remain unprepared and watch these forces destroy what you've built together. Or you can arm yourself with understanding that transforms this challenging period into an opportunity for growth, connection, and renewed attraction that surpasses what you had before.